Dating as far back as the 1960s, an urban legend known as the babysitter and the man upstairs has existed. It's a story of a teenage girl babysitting a few children. While the children are asleep at night and everything is quiet, the phone starts to ring. The voice on the other end is just a whisper. Have you checked the children? As the babysitter disregards the call as a prank and hangs up, the phone rings again and again and again. Every time the babysitter answers the phone, the same question. Have you checked the children? Acknowledging the calls won't stop. The babysitter phones the police. They tell her they will trace the next incoming call. So the phone rings again, followed by another terrifying whisper. The babysitter slams the phone down, and it rings again. And this time, it's the police.
He's in the house. The calls are coming from in the house. Get out now.
Many films have came from this urban legend. Foster's release in 1971, Black Christmas, 1974. The Sitter in 1977, When a Stranger Calls, 1979 and 2006, and When a Stranger Calls Back, 1993. But more often than not, truth is scarier than fiction. In 1950, Janett Christman was a babysitter, and being a babysitter was a rite of passage for teenagers for decades. It's a true sign of responsibility, independence. Janett Christman was born on March 21st, 1936. She was the oldest of 3 girls. Parents Charles and Lula Christman. Rita was just 18 months younger than Janett, and Cheryl was a newborn baby. The family had recently moved from Boonville, Missouri to Colombia. It was a smaller college town. Columbia is the home of the University of Missouri. The Christmans owned and operated a local restaurant. They lived on the upper level of the building where the restaurant was located. The family of 5 lived comfortably. They were well respected in the small community. In 1950, Janett was 13 years old and an 8th grader. Janett was intelligent. She was independent. She had a strong work ethic that she learned from her parents. She played the piano, went to church every Sunday. Her responsibility was well known in town, and she was highly sought after. Janett was mature for her young age. Looking so much older garnered much unwanted attention from older men. But Janett just called it hollers of hubba hubba and gave no attention. The night of Saturday, March 18th, 1950, Janett had agreed to babysit one of the regular kids, 3-year-old Gregory Romack. It was a Saturday night, and her friends had tried to convince her to go to a party. Janett decided to take the job instead. She had one last payment on a burgundy suit she wanted to wear for Easter, and she needed the money. That night, winter and spring collided. Wind gusts blew rain and sleet through the area. The temperatures dropped to the mid-20s. Janett arrived at the Romac's home around 7:30. When Janett finally arrives at the Romac household, Ed and Ann informed Janett that Gregory was already asleep and he wouldn't be any trouble. As a precaution, Ed showed Janett how to load and fire his shotgun. He left it leaned up against the wall next to the front door. If anyone unexpectedly came by, Janett was instructed to turn the front porch light on before answering the door. Not long after Janett's arrival, Ed and Ann leave. Janett was left alone with the sleeping child in a quiet house. Now, throughout the night, the weather got worse. The wind howled and the trees violently swayed. But the weather wasn't the only terrifying thing about that night. There was a human presence that was about to shatter the innocence of a young girl. The weather meant all was quiet at the Boone County Sheriff's Office. But just as deputies were getting settled in for a long and uneventful night, the phone rang. At 10:35, Deputy Ray McCowan picked up his ringing desk phone. He was met with screams that would replay in his head for the rest of his life. "Come quick!" a girl screamed hysterically. Before McCowan could even utter a word, the phone call was cut short, and all he heard was the deafening sound of the dial tone. Who was this girl? Where could she be? And what was actually happening? McCowan didn't believe it to be a prank. He heard terror in the girl's voice. But there was nothing he could do. Due to how late it was, the switchboard at the telephone company was closed, so the call couldn't be traced. Unnerved, all McCowan could do was wait and hope the girl called back. She never did. Soon after, Ann Romac called home to check in, but she received a busy signal. Ann had just assumed Janett was either on the line or had taken the phone off the hook and was sleeping. At around 1:35 in the morning, the Romacs pulled into their driveway. They had an enjoyable night at the Moon Valley Villa. It was a popular restaurant in Colombia. Several couples had gathered for drinks and cards and dinner, but their night of fun was about to turn into one of horror. The Romacs notice, as they pull into their driveway, that the front porch light was on and the front window drapes were still wide open. As Ed went to unlock the front door, he realized it was already unlocked. He eased open the door and came upon a horrifying sight. Janett Christman, just 3 days shy of her 14th birthday, was sprawled on the living room floor. She had been beaten and strangled to death. Janett was lying in a pool of her own blood. It had soaked everything. It even went through the shag carpet. This was such a violent attack. Janett had wounds on both sides of her head, specifically puncture marks that seemed to have been made by a small metal instrument. Her face had been scratched, possibly by fingernails. A cord from an electric iron was found wrapped around her neck. Her cause of death was ruled asphyxiation. Next to her was the phone, dangling off the hook. Ed and Ann immediately rushed to Gregory's room, but the little boy was unharmed, still soundly sleeping. The only sound in the house was that of the small radio that Gregory fell asleep to. While this jurisdiction belonged to Boone County, the Columbia Police Department were the first on the scene. From the start, It was a fight for leadership and conflicting egos. They even had conflicting theories. The sheriff's office believed Janett knew the intruder, invited him in, while the police department believed he came in through a broken side window. Instead of working together, the two agencies were uncooperative. While they were battling for authority, the town of Colombia was in a state of terror. Officers began patrolling 24 hours a day, stakeouts and neighborhood canvassing. Even some citizens were temporarily deputized in order to help find the murderer that was running loose. Anyone that had a previous record was hauled in for questioning. But this wasn't the first time terror had struck this small town. For several years before Janett's murder, the town experienced a rash of prowling and peeping Tom incidents. While authorities had closed those cases, Janett's case made the citizens of Colombia doubt whether justice had actually been served. Was the killer still out there? Had he been out there the whole time? Eventually, investigators focused their attentions on one man, Robert Mueller. He was a high school friend of Ed Romack. He was a 27-year-old former Army captain that served in World War II. He was married, had several children, and managed a restaurant. Mueller was known for dressing well and always carrying a mechanical pencil in his pocket. He was also known for being inappropriate with women. Just one day before Janett's murder, Mueller had grabbed Ann Romack's breast and made lewd comments towards her. But Mueller seemed to have a special affinity for young girls. In particular, Janett. On more than one occasion, Mueller had made comments about Janett's well-developed body. And the night of Janett's murder, Mueller was also attending the same gathering as the Romacks. At some point during the party, Mueller excused himself. He was gone for 2 hours. Circumstantial evidence against Mueller was overwhelming. May 4th, 1950. Officers took Mueller into custody, but instead of following procedure and taking him to the police station, they drove him to a farm outside Colombia. Early the next morning, Mueller agreed to take a polygraph test. He passed, and officers had to release him from custody. The tactics officers used in interrogating Mueller were unusual. In addition, a grand jury failed to indict Mueller based on the unprofessional conduct within the interrogation, as well as the lack of cooperation between the two law enforcement agencies. Robert Mueller was never charged with Janett's murder. Janett Christman was buried March 21st, 1950, her 14th birthday. She was wearing the burgundy suit, and officially, the crime remains unsolved.